Speaking of reliability, a podcast with good friends talking with you about reliability engineering topics. Welcome to Speaking of Reliability. This is Fred Schenkelberg.
This is Chris Jackson. And what are we talking about this week, Fred?
Well, it wasn't a specific request. It was an idea that somebody was posing for an article for the site. So more like a suggestion, I guess. And it just, I don't know, it didn't smell right. And I'm not exactly sure why. Without getting into all the details of it, but it was basically if you've got, you don't really want to use just the basic fit rate that the vendor sends you, and you ask them for the data, which I think is a good idea. Ask them for the data, right? And
right.
What test did you run? What conditions? All those kinds of things. That's a good thing to do. But then it's turned odd to me. It was, instead of saying, all right, well, they ran this temperature, this stress, for this kind of condition, they were saying, we're looking for this kind of failure mechanism. You could use some model if it was available for that failure mechanism under those stresses to say, all right, here's some early tail of our distribution for this thing. You get some information that way. That's the way I would approach it. But what he was talking about, and I've heard about it before, is you say, all right, well, I had 77 samples, let's say, and I ran them for 1,000 hours. Well, calculating a failure rate out of that is really difficult because dividing by zero is frowned on. Mathematicians, do stuff with that.
Yep.
I think there's something wrong with our math, but that's the way it works. So anyway, he said, well, so we assume that there's a failure in the next instant, and we have one failure. And so you do the calculations, and you get a failure rate estimate based on no failures. And it's like, okay, so 77,000 divided by 1, and you get a number, or 1 divided by 77,000 hours. And it's assuming it's a constant failure rate, so you can just tally up all the hours for all the individual units. I always would go with, it only ran 1,000 hours and you had no failures. So it's 1,000 hours divided, not 77,000. Don't assume it's exponential. And nobody liked that because you get a much lower number. But then he said, then that calculation is your 60th percentile confidence bound, lower confidence bound for that failure rate. I'm like,
right.
What? Where? How, what? I don't understand where that came from. And that's what basically was like, I need to talk to Chris about this one.
I'm familiar with it, and I mean that whole assumption stuff where we'll assume the failure is imminent is a phrase I hear a lot, and you have a lower confidence bound and it's based on something. But this is, I suppose, the bigger point for me is that the reliability standards that seem to, the textbooks, professors, the old guys.
Is this your ponderous professor from your webinars?
Yeah, that dude. They all drink from the classical or frequentist school of statistics, Kool-Aid. It's always that. It's always that. Because you can't use Bayesian analysis, because Bayesian analysis introduces opinions and subjectivity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's from Berkeley. I went to Stanford, so I'm a frequentist. I'm sorry. We have football teams that rival, so we can't do theirs and they can't do ours. But when you actually talk to the statisticians in both buildings, they're like, oh, yeah, no, we use all this stuff all the time.
Right. But in terms of what we're supposed to use and what people are trying to copy from textbooks, when they have this problem that this person has assumed, we're going to assume a 60% lower confidence bound and all that sort of good stuff. The problem I have is that those sorts of activities and those sorts of processes and procedures where failure is imminent, 60th percentile lower confidence bounds and things like that, it's neither one thing nor the other. It's got this frequentist-based space because everything has to be frequentist or classical. You can't have Bayesian, you can't have subjective opinions and anything else. But everything else after that is subjective opinion, like we're going to have a failure occur imminently after we finish testing. And we're going to have a 60th percentile lower confidence bound, which is based on your favorite, the constant hazard rate. And that lower confidence bound is chosen for a reason, because it tends to be quite conservative, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
But by the same token, if you've got something which is not exhibiting any failures during your testing, you don't know how it's going to fail. So you don't. If that's the only thing you're going off.
That's if the only thing you got is that we ran 77 units for 1,000 hours. And see, that's where I think where I deviated was even earlier. It was, well, why were you testing at 85C? For what failure mechanism? What was this test supposed to show? If you had an issue with epoxy attachment and it would reveal contamination issues, or if it had a CTE issue, if you had a thermal cycling, or a cracking issue, if you had, loading and cyclic loading, if the test was actually useful, which is, I think, the first assumption, it's there to say there is or is not presence of one or more failure mechanisms. Well, which ones? Right. So if I know that it's like a solder joint test, right, and we're doing thermal cycling, and I'm familiar with the solder makeup itself, like SAC solder today, there's a reasonable model that says, well, if you run 1,000 cycles of that within this range of geometries, and you don't get a failure, you're pretty much certain that you're, 1 percentile. What's the probability of getting a failure, just even one failure out of how many samples you ran over that time frame? And you can play with, well, if the Weibull curve was here, then I know that I should have seen one if that's where the curve is. But if I push the curve more to the right, then I would expect there to be not a failure. And that's where I can say the Weibull distribution is lower tail is about here, with some very frequentist thinking. But I don't assume a confidence bound. I don't have any data to do a variance at all.
Right.
So no, we're at least this good at this moment. That's our best estimate. But it's based on the assumption that I know the failure mechanism that this test was evaluating the product for. And if anything failed, it would most likely be this mechanism. So,
right.
And then I'm making assumptions, but I'm not making it an exponential assumption. I'm making an assumption based on the knowledge that is that like Bayesian? Am I dangerously close to that world? I'm using the prior knowledge of what I'm actually supposed to be testing for, and then saying, well, those are typically Weibull distributions, and it's,
Oh, yeah. That's the thing. Inherent Bayesian, there's a statistical interpretation of Bayesian.
I have to throw out my diploma now.
It's just, I think we, at the end of the day, we furiously agree. Information is everywhere. It's in our brains. It's in our experiences. It's not just on a test. And if you want to throw away all the information that you and the people who work with you have gathered over the years and just rely on 77 hours worth of testing, well, that's just expensive apart from anything else.
Yeah, that's true.
But there's no such thing as an exclusively frequentist approach. And I'll give you an example. We see confidence bounds all the time. You talked about a confidence bound.
Yeah.
And invariably, those confidence bounds are interpreted as a region within which we think there is a pretty good chance of something we're trying to study lying in. Mm-hmm. So we might have a confidence bound in the MTBF or the failure rate. And if it's a 90% confidence bound, then that implies we would expect with 90% confidence that the true MTBF or the true failure rate lies within those bounds. But in the frequentist school, it's actually about you. So if you do an analysis and you come up with 90% confidence bounds using classical statistics, technically you're not allowed to say we believe there's a 90% chance of real values between these two numbers. No. The correct interpretation is that if I was to do this analysis 100,000 times for different subjects, for different data sets, using different approaches, but all from the world of classical statistics, then my 90% confidence bounds would contain the true value 90% of the time. So it's not about that, and that sounds like a semantic.
Yeah, no, I've always struggled with that. It sounds exactly the same, but just a different view of it.
Right. There's a 90% chance I'm right. And in fact, there are some textbooks where, you know, the pioneers of this world are famously and angrily quoted as saying, you can never, ever, ever use, if everyone says that this is a confidence bound and there's a 90% chance of this true value lying between these two bounds, you must immediately stop them and correct them and tell you, no, it's just that if I was to do this analysis 100 times, you'd expect me to be right 90% of the time. You expect the true value to fall within 90% of my analyses, which is, again, as soon as you start having that conversation with people, they start sleeping with their eyes open. And it's not useful. It's not useful. And for making key decisions.
We're not going to run it 100 times.
Right. It's not even 100 times. It's 100 different data sets. Using my mind, using my classical school, when to come up, it's actually largely an irrelevant number. And that is not very useful at all, because we need to make analyses and multi-billion-dollar decisions based on the more logical interpretation of a confidence bound, which is what we call subjective probability, which is Bayesian. So we all use confidence bounds as if they're Bayesian. We do, because it makes sense. It's how the human brain is wired. And so it's just, I really struggle with the sort of chimeric approaches where you have sort of, you can see the classical or frequentist school pedigree embedded in this completely made up scenario, which is inherently Bayesian because you're introducing your own opinions and thoughts into it. We are going to have a failure if we keep testing for another second once we're finished.
Yeah.
That's an assumption.
It is. Yeah. And it's, so what's a person to do if you went to the step and got test data, instead of just whatever their failure rate was, their claim of their failure rate, what's the appropriate thing to do?
Well, again, we're gonna get down a rabbit warren, aren't we? I mean, what's the decision? There we go.
Yeah. Well, I agree. It's like if I have two vendors and I'm evaluating them and saying which one will meet our 10-year lifetime requirement, and this needs to meet X reliability of some sort over that duration and given stresses and all the other good stuff, right? And we got two vendors and they're both claiming, a infinitesimal small failure rate. Like, well, what's your proof of this? What's your data? And they send you we did these three standard tests and they all had 3 batches and they all had 0 failures. So there's not, to me, if both vendors do exact same standard tests and their test facilities seem capable of doing them and they both ran the same number of samples and all that good stuff and they both got no failures, to me, there's no information there whatsoever except how good the lunch was that they provided when we visited.
Yeah, by the same token, though, if that component of your system there are some conclusions you can make from a 0 failure test. Don't care what anybody says. They're not particularly strong in some cases, but that's okay. If you've got 10 components who the failure rate or reliability is 50 times worse. I mean, while you're faffing around selecting between these two vendors, if you know that there are other components in your product which are almost certainly going to fail before either of one of these two do so, pick one, then move on.
Yeah, pick one and move on. But let's say this is our core critical piece and we're trying to find a solution that's better than what we got now because it's not good enough. I mean, the reason you go into more depth on these things is because it is important, but it's back to what's your right decision. It could be selecting two vendors, or it could be changing technology, saying, hey, what we got now is just not cutting it anymore. We got to change technology and go to a new system, a new invention or something like that. I mean, if it's important enough, my thought is you need to test it. Is run your
Right.
own sequence on this stuff. Now, if the vendor has some data, but if it's that zero failure type stuff, I think there's still a pile of work to do before you can really get meaningful information out of it.
Hell yeah. I mean, if you're, like you said, if this is the centerpiece, if this is the critical piece, the Jesus nut of your product, why would you even entertain the idea of just taking the vendor's word for it? Are you gonna let the success or failure of your product hinge upon data which has zero failures in 77 hours, and you're adding all that up?
For a benign environment.
Right, and that goes back to the culture. I mean, if your organisation is trying to get out of having to really understand the most important part of your product, then that's the issue. But I mean, again, it's either important or it's not. If it's not important, then pick one and move on. If it is important, then you better be using something more than vendor specs with zero failures.
Okay, so let's put one in the middle here. I'm going to try to pin you down on something here.
Oh, geez.
Yeah. Now, let's say it's, I'm building a model, a block diagram for the system. And the components, not our most critical piece, our tall tent. We know that the most important one, a couple of them, we're working on those. We got tests running. We got vendor collaboration. We got all this good stuff going on. But I've got these other 4 or 5 components or subsystems that I don't have the budget or time to do a full scale investigation of it. And I got a fit rate from the vendor, which I don't believe. And I really don't want to go to the Mill Handbook 217 from 25 years ago and pull out a random number. And I asked the vendor for data, and they send me that 77 samples ran for 1,000 hours with no failures. Now what do I do?
You have to do some research, don't you?
Yeah.
I mean, let's say it's a capacitor.
Yeah.
And you can do research and know how those particular capacitors fail. You might even find out what you need to design into your system to try and prolong the life of said capacitor.
Mm-hmm.
For example, do you have to have some sort of subsystem or component which cleans the power supply so you don't get voltage spikes that ruin the day of said capacitor? Or if it's that much of a concern, do you have to have some sort of redundancy? I mean, there's something you need to do. I mean, at the end of the day, something's got to give. If you've got no money, you've got no time to understand the reliability of these components and they're somehow important to your system, then you need to say, okay, we have to accept that there is a risk. This capacitor might not be as reliable as we would like it to be through just lack of information. Okay, so what do you do about it? Well, you can certainly do research is free. I can guarantee you can Google.
Until you want to read the paper, and then it's bundled up by one of the professional societies, and it costs $500 a paper to get access to it. I always find that difficult.
I don't necessarily agree with that. I mean, look at bearings, for example. If you want to find out how ball bearings fail.
There's tons of stuff out there.
Right.
Yeah. And I agree with you. Some vendors have good papers out there. Some make them available. And there's Google Scholar is a wonderful tool to get. And then I've often just written straight to the author and said, hey, could I get a copy of your paper? And they send it to me. I agree. There's ways to go do it, but it's not free. It takes time, and you have to have library access. Not everybody does anymore.
I'll tell you what, there is at least the research you do, which you classify as free, let's just call it Google search. At least explore that option.
Yeah.
I'd at least explore that.
Well, I found that there's a step before that is go talk to your key engineers that know that technology and say, well, what is your estimate of its reliability that you can support, that you have evidence for? And it might be based on, I've worked with this technology and under these conditions, and I'd say it's X. But there's a lot of, I think that smacks of some of what you would call Bayesian, is go ask 5 experts and pool that number together, or ask 10 people and that are familiar with the technology and pull that number together and say, that's the starting point. Now I always put those in a fuzzy font and saying, well, I don't have hard evidence here. I guess that's my frequentist talking, but it's our best estimate today. And if it's not the worst of the 5 that I need to go figure out, and it's good enough, I'm going to go, even if the lowest estimate is good enough, I'm like, let's move on. Let's get the other 4. But if it becomes the number 3 item we got to solve, and the first 2 are being done, then I go back. Then I would go do the research. I do the free research, or I do those both simultaneously, actually, because sometimes you find that golden paper that says, "Oh, in your circumstance, I did this once with a capacitor. It was a large format capacitors, and it was the same. It was by the company that formulated the capacitor, designed it." And they did all these life studies on it, and they put in their curves. It was a very steep Weibull curve. It would run great for a number of years, and then it had a beta of 7. So it just said, all right, I'm done. We only do this for so long, and then we're done. And it was perfect. It was exactly what we were looking for. And I called them up, and they had all the data for it. And I'm like, sometimes you find the golden nugget, but sometimes you find just what's the typical failure mechanisms for different environments, and you can narrow it down and then refine your search.
Well, that's a lot. That sounds like you're trying to break the problem where, the producer, the manufacturer actually does have data that you have access to, which is but the whole idea of asking people in your organization in their opinion, that sounds like what I call free research.
Yep,
it's all
yep,
free
pretty
research.
much, yeah.
Google, those guys, just opinions.
Yeah.
Just opinions. And so, I would not exclude those guys. And when I say do your free research first, but again, I mean, it comes back to the decision. If this thing that this guy's talking about, if it's so important, it's a critical part of your system when it comes to reliability characteristics, you better not be assuming it's going to fail the second after those tests were finished. I mean, that's just if you're forced to put a number into a test exam to have an answer, that's the sort of approach you're using. But do you want to make a profit or not?
Well, let's assume our listeners want to make a profit, and so that's the gist of it. There's probably a subject for a whole nother podcast. But the idea is that I guess you're just making a different set of assumptions than I'm comfortable with. But is it really what you need to do or want to do? And I don't see that. So anyway, hopefully there's a couple of ideas in there. If you're faced with that kind of dilemma and you're pulling out whatever standard or textbook that says, oh, this is the lower bound 60 percentile, blah, blah, blah. Realize what you're doing and that you could do much better. And I think that's the gist of it. But if you've got any questions about this and data analysis or the debate that Chris and I regularly have on Bayesian and frequentist and our murky use of each other's approaches to statistics, let us know. Head over to accendoreliability.com/go/SOR, and you can find a couple of ways to get in touch with us. Also, Chris and I and the other hosts are available through LinkedIn and our About pages. And this episode is 827 in our list, Chris, and I think we've had episodes probably close to 300, 350 or so that were really just sparked by people's questions. So I'd like to increase that percentage. So that's where folks that are listening should pick up the phone or write us a note or hit one of our websites and let us know what's on your mind. And we'd love to include that into one of the future episodes. So with that, I think I'm just going to go find some more rich data sets to go play with.
Wikipedia.
There you go. Yeah. Let's see what I can find. All right. Well, thanks, Chris. Thanks for clearing that up for me a little bit. I knew I didn't like what that was, but I couldn't put my finger on why. So.
No worries. Always a pleasure, Fred.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Cheers, Fred. See ya.
Thanks for listening to Speaking of Reliability. We invite you to join the conversation. If you have a question or a topic that you think we should discuss in a future show, please let us know. You can find a comment box below the episode show notes, or just leave a note as part of a review on iTunes.